They found her near death in the snow on Christmas Eve, cast out by her own blood into a winter that showed no mercy. Frances Walker had been called many things: brilliant with numbers, too clever for her own good, a burden without a husband to claim her. But on that frozen night, she became something else entirely, a woman worth saving in the eyes of a man who had forgotten how to feel. The Duke of Ravenswood was known for his scars and his silence, for walls built so high that society had stopped trying to scale them. Yet when his carriage stopped on that desolate road, something changed in the darkness between them, something neither the cold nor propriety could contain. The iron gates of Walker House closed with a sound that felt like finality itself. Frances Walker stood on the wrong side of them, watching the last place she had called home disappear behind curtains of falling snow. Her breath came in short, visible bursts, each one a small ghost that vanished into the December night. Inside those walls, her sister Grace was already moving through the rooms, as though Frances had never existed. The thought should have hurt more than it did, but the cold had a way of numbing everything, even heartbreak. Grace had waited until their father was 6 months in the ground before showing her true nature. The will had been read, the estate passed to the eldest daughter as tradition demanded, and Frances had foolishly believed that blood would count for something, that the years she had spent managing the accounts, dealing with tenants, keeping the household running while Grace attended parties and cultivated suitors would mean she had earned her place. She had been wrong. The argument had started over the tenant farmers. Old Mr. Winters and his family were 3 months behind on rent because of a failed harvest, and Frances had suggested they be given an extension through spring. Grace had laughed, a sound without warmth, and called her sister soft and foolish. When Frances had pressed the issue, pointing out that throwing a family into the winter cold would mean their deaths, Grace's expression had turned to ice. "You think you know better than me. You think because Father let you play at being useful that you have any real say in how things are run. You are a burden, Frances, an unmarried woman with no dowry, no prospects, and no purpose. I have been patient, but my generosity has limits." Frances had felt the ground shift beneath her feet even before Grace spoke the words that would seal her fate. "Leave. Tonight. I will not have you undermining my authority in my own home. You have until the snow gets worse. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had known Frances since childhood, had wept as she pressed a small purse into her hands and wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders. It was not enough money for lodging, not enough warmth for the night ahead, but it was all she dared give without facing Grace's wrath. The snow had been gentle when Frances first stepped onto the road, but within an hour it became something else entirely. Wind cut through her dress like knives, and the shawl might as well have been made of paper. The small market town was 5 miles away, but the darkness and the storm made distance meaningless. She walked because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying, and some stubborn part of her refused to grant Grace that final victory. But the body had limits that pride could not overcome. Her feet went numb first, then her hands. The purse slipped from her fingers at some point, disappearing into a snowdrift, but she could not remember when. The road became harder to see, the world narrowing to white and grey, and the burning cold that felt increasingly like warmth. She knew what that meant. She had read enough to understand that when the cold stopped hurting, when the body felt hot and sleepy, death was close. The small grove of trees appeared like a sanctuary. Frances stumbled toward them, her legs no longer quite obeying her commands. She sank down against a trunk, the snow already beginning to cover her skirts. This is how it ends, she thought, with something like wonder. On Christmas Eve, alone, because I dared to care about people my sister considered beneath her notice. There was a strange peace in accepting it. The fighting could stop. The struggling and the hoping and the endless trying to prove her worth to people who would never see it could finally end. She closed her eyes. The sound of horses came from very far away, or perhaps very close. Frances could not tell any more. There were voices, male and urgent, cutting through the wind. "Stop, stop the carriage now." Footsteps crunched through snow. Strong hands touched her face, tilted her chin up. She tried to open her eyes, but could only manage a flutter. The voice came again, closer now, rough with command and something else, something that sounded almost like fear. She is barely breathing. Get blankets. Move. Frances felt herself lifted, cradled against warmth that hurt and soothed in equal measure. There was the smell of wool and leather and something clean like winter air but human, alive. She tried to speak, to say that it was too late, that she was already going, but her lips would not form words. The last thing she registered before darkness took her completely was the voice again, firm and absolute, speaking to someone she could not see. Do not let her die. Whatever it takes, do not let her die. Then there was nothing but the sound of her own heart, beating slower and slower, and the distant sense of motion of being carried somewhere through the storm. When consciousness finally slipped away entirely, Frances Walker did not know if she would wake again. But somewhere in the last fragments of awareness, she felt the tightening of arms around her, the determination in that unknown voice, and a small, impossible part of her wondered if perhaps this was not quite the end after all. The snow continued to fall, covering the road, the grove, and the spot where she had nearly become another winter casualty. But the carriage rolled on through the storm, carrying her toward a fate she could never have imagined, and a man who would change everything about the life she thought she was leaving behind. Warmth was the first thing Frances became aware of, a sensation so foreign after the cold that for a moment she thought she might be dreaming. Then came the softness beneath her, the weight of heavy blankets, and the faint scent of lavender and beeswax. She opened her eyes slowly, wincing at the light filtering through tall windows. The room around her was nothing like the practical, worn spaces of Walker House. Here the walls were painted a soft cream, the furniture was dark and polished, and everything spoke of wealth maintained with care rather than displayed for show. A fire crackled in the hearth, and beside it sat a woman of perhaps 50 years, her grey hair pinned severely back, her posture suggesting someone accustomed to command. She looked up from her needlework as Frances stirred, and her expression softened slightly. Awake at last. You gave us quite a fright, miss. Frances tried to sit up, but her body protested with 1,000 small aches. Her fingers and toes burned with the peculiar pain of flesh remembering warmth. Where am I? Her voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. The woman set aside her needlework and rose, moving to pour water from a pitcher into a glass. She brought it to the bedside, her manner efficient but not unkind. You are at Ravenswood Manor, miss. His Grace found you on the road 2 nights ago, more dead than alive. The physician said another hour, and we would have been preparing a grave rather than a recovery. Frances took the glass with trembling hands, the water soothing her parched throat. 2 nights. She had lost 2 entire days to darkness and dreams she could not quite remember. His Grace. You mean there is a duke here? The woman's expression became carefully neutral, the kind of face a skilled servant learned to wear when discussing their employer. John Montgomery, the Duke of Ravenswood. This is his estate. I am Mrs. Hargrove, the head housekeeper. His Grace gave strict orders that you were to have the best care and that we were to inform him the moment you woke. The name meant nothing to Frances, but the title stirred something in her memory. She had heard whispers at the few social gatherings she had attended, fragments of gossip about a duke who had withdrawn from society, who lived alone in a vast estate and refused all invitations. There had been a tragedy, a fire, she thought, and scars that had made him a recluse. I cannot pay for this care. Frances forced the words out, hating how they revealed her circumstances, but needing to be honest. I have no money, no family willing to help me. I do not want to abuse anyone's charity. Mrs. Hargrove's expression softened further, and for a moment she looked almost maternal. His Grace asked for no payment, miss. He only asked that you be kept comfortable and safe. As for leaving, I am afraid that is not possible at present. The storm has blocked the roads. No one can come in or go out until it passes. She moved to the window and drew back the curtain slightly. Frances could see nothing but white, a world erased by snow. You should rest. I will bring you some broth. The physician said you must eat lightly at first, to let your body adjust. When you are stronger, there will be time enough to discuss the future. But Frances could not rest, not with questions crowding her mind and anxiety tightening her chest. She pushed herself more upright, ignoring the protest of her muscles. Why would he save me? A duke does not ride out in storms to rescue strangers. There must be something he expects in return. Mrs. Hargrove paused at the door, her hand on the frame. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of something Francis could not quite identify. Sadness, perhaps, or understanding. His Grace is not like other men of his station, miss. He knows what it is to be left to die. Perhaps that is why he could not leave you. Then she was gone, leaving Francis alone with those cryptic words and the crackling of the fire. Francis lay back against the pillows, her mind racing despite her body's exhaustion. She was trapped in the house of a man she had never met, a man society whispered about in tones of pity and fascination, a man who had saved her life, but whose motives she could not begin to guess. She turned her head to look at the room again, really seeing it this time. There were books on a small table by the window, their spines worn with use. A vase held winter greenery, holly and ivy arranged with care. Someone had thought about making this space comfortable, welcoming even. It was more kindness than her own sister had shown her. The thought brought a sharp pain to her chest, one that had nothing to do with physical injury. Grace had thrown her out, knowing the storm was coming, knowing Francis had nowhere to go. Had she hoped Francis would die, or had she simply not cared enough to consider the possibility? Francis closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. Instead, she found herself replaying that last conversation, hearing Grace's cold dismissal, feeling again that moment when she understood that she was truly alone in the world, except she was not dead. Against all odds, she was alive, warm, and safe in the home of a stranger who had asked nothing of her. She opened her eyes again, staring at the ceiling with its delicate plasterwork. The house was silent around her, so quiet she could hear the whisper of snow against the windows. It was the kind of silence that spoke of emptiness, of rooms that went unused and halls that echoed with absence. A recluse, they had called him, a man marked by tragedy who had turned his back on the world. Francis understood something about that now, about wanting to disappear, to stop trying to fit into spaces that would never make room for you. But she could not afford to disappear. She had to survive, to find a way forward, and that meant she could not stay here indefinitely, living on the charity of a man she did not know. As soon as the roads cleared, she would leave. She would find a position somewhere, perhaps as a governess or a companion to an elderly lady. She had education and skills with numbers. Surely someone would hire her, despite her lack of references. The alternative, returning to Grace and begging for her place back, was unthinkable. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in this vast, silent house, the Duke of Ravenswood moved through his solitary existence, unaware that the woman he had saved was already planning her escape from his kindness. Francis pulled the blankets higher and stared at the fire, watching the flames dance and wondering what kind of man saves a stranger's life and asks for nothing in return. Wondering, too, what scars he carried that had made him understand what it meant to be left for dead. The answers, she knew, would have to wait. But as exhaustion finally began to pull her back towards sleep, she found herself curious, despite her caution, despite her determination to leave as soon as possible. Who was John Montgomery, Duke of Ravenswood? And why, in a house this large and obviously well-staffed, did it feel like he was the loneliest person in it? 3 days passed before Francis felt strong enough to leave her room. Mrs. Hargrove had been attentive, bringing meals and fresh clothes that fit surprisingly well, though Francis tried not to think too hard about where they had come from. The snow continued to fall, lighter now but persistent, keeping the world locked in winter's grip. On the 4th morning, restlessness won over caution. Francis dressed in a simple grey wool dress and ventured into the corridor, her curiosity stronger than her sense of propriety. Ravenswood Manor revealed itself slowly as she walked. The hallways were wide and well-maintained, but there was a stillness to them that felt deliberate, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Montgomerys staring down with expressions ranging from stern to melancholy. She paused before one of a young man with laughing eyes and wondered if this was the brother who had died in the fire. The thought made her move on quickly. She found herself drawn down a corridor where a different scent hung in the air, the unmistakable smell of old paper and leather bindings. Following it like a thread, she discovered a set of double doors standing slightly ajar. The library beyond was magnificent. Shelves rose to a vaulted ceiling, filled with more books than Francis had ever seen in one place. Tall windows let in the winter light, making the snow-covered grounds visible beyond. But what caught her attention most were the papers spread across a massive oak table. Maps, ledgers, architectural drawings, all covered in neat, precise handwriting. She moved closer without thinking, her mind already cataloguing what she saw. Estate maps showing fields and forests, tenant locations, water sources. Financial records tracking harvests and expenditures, plans for drainage systems and crop rotations. It was exactly the kind of work she had done for her father, the work Grace had dismissed as playing at usefulness. Frances leaned over one of the maps, tracing the lines of a drainage system with her finger. The design was good, but there was a problem with the eastern fields. The water would pool there during heavy rains, exactly where the plan showed new planting. She was so absorbed in the problem that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until a voice spoke from the shadows near the fireplace. "I do not remember hiring a new estate manager." Frances spun around, her heart lurching. The man rising from the wing-back chair was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair touched with grey at the temples, despite his apparent youth. His face was angular, strong-featured, and yes, there was a scar, thin and pale, running from his left temple down toward his jaw. But it was his eyes that held her, grey as storm clouds and just as turbulent. This was the Duke of Ravenswood. Frances sank into a curtsy, her cheeks burning. "Your Grace, forgive me. I should not have intruded. I was only walking and I smelled the books and I did not think. Stand up, please." She rose slowly, keeping her eyes lowered, but he moved closer until she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "You were examining my drainage plans." His voice was neither warm nor cold, simply direct. "Why?" "I used to manage my father's estate." The words came out before she could stop them. "I kept his accounts, dealt with the tenants, planned the rotations and repairs. When I saw the maps, I could not help but look. Old habits." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of interest replacing the initial guardedness. "And what did you see in those old habits of yours?" Frances hesitated, caught between the desire to be helpful and the fear of overstepping. But he waited, patient and attentive in a way that made her decide on honesty. "Your eastern fields, Your Grace. The drainage plan routes water through that section, but the elevation is too low. During spring rains, you will have flooding exactly where you intend to plant. The water needs to be redirected further north, where the ground slopes naturally toward the stream." He moved to the table, studying the map she had indicated. His fingers traced the same lines she had followed, and she could see his mind working through the problem. "You are correct." He looked up at her, and for the first time, something that might have been approval touched his features. "I have been staring at these plans for weeks and missed it entirely. Show me what you would do differently." It was not a request. Frances moved to the table, her earlier nervousness fading as she fell into familiar territory. She pointed to the northern section, explaining how a slight adjustment to the drainage route would use the natural topography to prevent flooding while still irrigating the fields properly. "John," she had learned his given name from Mrs. Hargrove listened without interrupting. When she finished, he pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. "Show me the calculations. Prove that the grade is sufficient." For the next hour, they worked side by side. Frances sketched rough diagrams, calculated slopes and water volumes, while John asked questions that showed a sharp, analytical mind. He was not simply accepting her suggestions, he was testing them, challenging her reasoning, making her defend every conclusion. It was exhilarating. No one, not even her father, had ever engaged with her ideas this way. Grace had dismissed her work as unwomanly meddling. The few estate managers she had dealt with had tolerated her input with barely concealed condescension. But John treated her as an equal, someone whose knowledge had value regardless of her gender. "You studied surveying." It was not quite a question. "My father taught me. He believed that understanding the land was essential to managing it well." After he became ill, I took over most of the practical work. Francis paused, then added quietly, "My sister thought it made me unmarriageable. She was probably right." John's expression hardened slightly. "Your sister is the one who cast you out." Francis looked down at the papers in front of her, shame and anger warring in her chest. "Yes. She inherited the estate when father died. I thought I had earned a place there, but I was wrong. She made it clear I was a burden, and when I disagreed with her treatment of the tenants, she decided she had tolerated me long enough." The silence that followed was heavy. When Francis finally looked up, she found John watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You disagreed with her treatment of the tenants. What did she do?" "She wanted to evict a family in the middle of winter because they were behind on rent. The harvest had failed. They had children. I said it would be their death sentence." Francis felt her jaw tighten at the memory. She said I was soft and foolish. That sentiment had no place in estate management. When I would not back down, she told me to leave. That night, in the storm, and you would have died if I had not been traveling that road. His voice had gone very quiet, almost dangerous. "She sent you out knowing you had no shelter, no money, no way to survive the night." Francis met his eyes and saw something there that surprised her. Fury, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "I am not her responsibility, Your Grace. I am a grown woman. I should have made better arrangements for my future, instead of assuming family loyalty would sustain me. That is remarkably generous considering she tried to kill you." The blunt words hung in the air between them. Francis wanted to protest, but she could not. He was right. Grace might not have wielded a knife, but the effect had been the same. John stood abruptly, walking to the window. Snow continued to fall, gentle now, blanketing the world in silence. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. "You have a gift for this work. Estate management, I mean. It is rare to find someone who understands both the practical and financial aspects so thoroughly." He turned back to face her. "While the snow keeps you here, I would appreciate your input on other problems I have been struggling with, if you are willing." Francis felt something unfurl in her chest, something that had been tightly closed since the night Grace threw her out. For the first time in months, someone saw her as useful, competent, valuable. "I would be honored, Your Grace." "John. When we are working, you may call me John. Titles are tedious when discussing drainage ditches." Despite everything, Francis felt a smile tug at her lips. "Very well, John." He returned to the table, pulling out another set of papers. "These show the tenant agreements. Several families have asked for extensions on rent, similar to the situation with your sister's tenants. I believe they are genuine cases of hardship, but I would value a second opinion before making a decision." Francis took the papers, her heart lifting in a way she had not expected. He was asking for her judgment, trusting her experience. After months of being told her opinions did not matter, here was someone treating her knowledge as worthy of respect. As she began to read through the agreements, she was acutely aware of John beside her, the quiet focus of his attention, the careful way he listened when she spoke. There was a loneliness to him, she realized, a sense of a man who had been isolated for so long that connection had become foreign. But in this moment, working together over maps and numbers, something shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but the beginning of recognition. Two people who had been dismissed by the world, finding value in each other. Outside, the snow continued to fall, trapping them together in Ravenswood Manor. And for the first time since her rescue, Francis wondered if perhaps being trapped here might not be the worst fate after all. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Each morning, Francis would wake to find a breakfast tray outside her door and a note in neat handwriting indicating which room John would be working in that day. The library, the estate office, sometimes the conservatory where he kept architectural drawings spread across tables made of glass and iron. She would join him after dressing, and they would work through problems that had accumulated during his years of solitary management. Tenant disputes, repair priorities, investment opportunities. John consulted her on everything, his initial wariness giving way to something that looked almost like partnership. Francis had never experienced anything like it. Even with her father, she had been an assistant, helpful, but ultimately secondary. With John, her opinions carried weight. When she suggested a different approach to organizing the account books, he implemented it immediately. When she pointed out a flaw in a contract, he rewrote it. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being genuinely useful. But there were other things she noticed too, small gestures that had nothing to do with estate business. The way John would pull out her chair before she could reach for it, the movement so automatic he seemed unaware of doing it. The cup of tea that would appear at her elbow precisely when she felt herself flagging. The careful way he angled the lamp so the light fell on her work rather than his own. He was, she realized, taking care of her in ways that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with attention. On the 5th day of their collaboration, they worked late into the afternoon, so absorbed in restructuring the crop rotation schedule that neither noticed the fading light until Mrs. Hargrove appeared with an invitation to dinner. His Grace thought you might prefer to dine in the winter parlour this evening, miss. More comfortable than taking your meal alone in your room. Francis glanced at John, unsure. Is that appropriate? John's expression remained neutral, but there was something almost vulnerable in his eyes. I would appreciate the company, if you are comfortable with the informality. She found herself nodding before she could overthink it. I would enjoy that. Thank you. The winter parlour was smaller than the grand dining room she had glimpsed in her wanderings, but infinitely more inviting. A fire roared in the hearth, and the table was set for two, candles already lit against the gathering darkness outside. John held her chair, and Francis felt the brief warmth of his hand near her shoulder as she sat. He took his own seat across from her, and for a moment, awkwardness threatened. They had spent days working together, but this felt different, more personal somehow. Tell me about your father. John's voice broke the silence as the first course was served. You speak of him with respect, but there is grief there too. Francis traced the edge of her wineglass, considering her answer. He was a good man, fair with the tenants, careful with the land. After my mother died when I was 12, he raised Grace and me alone. She paused, remembering. He taught me everything I know about estate management, because he said a woman's mind was as sharp as any man's, and it was wasteful not to use it. A progressive view for a country gentleman. It made him unpopular in some circles. But he did not care much for society's opinions. When he became ill 3 years ago, I took over the daily management. He would review my decisions, offer guidance, but mostly he trusted me. Francis felt the familiar ache of loss. When he died, I thought I had proven myself, that Grace would see I had earned my place. I was a fool. You were loyal. John's voice was firm. There is no shame in expecting the same loyalty in return. She looked up at him, struck by the conviction in his tone. What about you, Your Grace? The house is full of servants, but you live like a hermit. Why? His expression shuttered slightly, but he did not deflect the question. After my brother died, people looked at me differently. Some with pity, some with fascination, like I was a curiosity to be examined. The scar, the tragedy, the supposedly broken duke. It became exhausting, performing grief for an audience that would never understand it. How did he die? Francis asked softly, if I may know. A fire in the East Wing, 7 years ago. Edward was 19, reckless and brilliant and full of life. There was an accident with a lamp while he was conducting some chemical experiment. John's jaw tightened. I pulled him out, but the smoke had already done its damage. He lived 3 days, long enough to suffer. I am so sorry. Everyone is sorry. That is precisely the problem. John stood abruptly, walking to the window. The snow had finally stopped, and stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. For years, every conversation began and ended with sympathy I did not want and could not accept, so I stopped having conversations. I closed the house to visitors, declined every invitation, and discovered that solitude, while lonely, was at least honest. Francis rose and moved to stand beside him, close enough to see their reflections in the glass. Solitude can be a refuge, but it can also become a prison if you are not careful. He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Is that what you think I have done? Made myself a prisoner? I think you survived something terrible and chose to protect yourself the only way you knew how. Her voice was gentle but unflinching. But I also think that surviving is not the same as living. The silence stretched between them, charged with something Francis could not quite name. John's eyes searched her face as though looking for something he had lost, and only now realized he missed. You are remarkably bold for someone who is a guest in my home. Despite the gravity of the moment, Francis felt a smile tug at her lips. I have already lost everything, Your Grace. It makes one either very careful or very honest. I seem to have chosen the latter. John. His voice was quiet but insistent. When it is just us, I am John. John. The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with connection. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she chose. When she did not move, his fingers brushed a strand of hair that had escaped her simple arrangement, tucking it gently behind her ear. The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. You have changed something in this house. He let his hand fall but did not step back. In me. I am not certain what to do with that. Francis felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Perhaps you do not have to do anything. Perhaps you simply allow it to be what it is. And what is it? I do not know yet. But it does not feel like a burden. His expression softened, something almost like wonder crossing his features. No, it does not feel like a burden at all. They stood there as the night deepened outside, the house silent around them except for the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Hargrove eventually returned to clear the dinner. Neither of them had finished, and the spell broke. But as Frances retired to her room later, she found herself touching the place where his fingers had brushed her temple, remembering the careful gentleness of the gesture. The way he had looked at her, as though she was something precious he was afraid to break. She lay awake long into the night, listening to the silence of Ravenswood Manor and wondering what it meant that she no longer wanted to leave. That the thought of the roads clearing and having to find another place to go filled her with something uncomfortably close to dread. Somewhere in the vast house, she imagined John was also awake, also wondering what was happening between them. Two people who had been cast aside by the world, finding in each other something neither had dared hope for. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in a sky finally free of clouds. The storm had passed, but neither of them was ready to face what that meant. Not yet, for now there was still time to exist in this suspended moment, where the world beyond the gates could not touch them and the future remained blessedly uncertain. Frances closed her eyes and let herself imagine just for tonight that this strange, unexpected refuge might become something more. That usefulness might become belonging, and belonging might become something deeper still. It was a dangerous thought, but as sleep finally claimed her, she found she did not care. Mrs. Hargrove mentioned it casually over breakfast, but the words lingered in Frances's mind all morning. His Grace asked if you play the pianoforte, miss. I told him I had heard you once when you thought no one was listening, that you play like someone telling their own soul through the keys. Frances had frozen with her teacup halfway to her lips. I did not know anyone heard that. The housekeeper's smile was kind but knowing. In a house this quiet, miss, music carries. His Grace has not allowed anyone to play the instrument since his brother died, but he asked me last evening if you might consider it. The weight of that request sat heavy in Frances's chest throughout the day. She knew what it meant, to open a room that had been closed, to allow sound into silence that had been carefully maintained. It was vulnerability of a kind John rarely showed. When she found him in the library that afternoon, surrounded by ledgers but clearly not reading them, she gathered her courage. Mrs. Hargrove said you asked about music. John looked up, and there was something almost anxious in his expression. I should not have presumed. If you would rather not, I understand. It is an imposition. It is not an imposition. Frances moved closer, her heart beating faster. But I have not played for an audience in a very long time. I am afraid I may not be as skilled as Mrs. Hargrove suggested. I doubt that. John stood, and Frances noticed how carefully he chose his next words. My brother loved music. He played violin, and I would sometimes accompany him on the pianoforte. After he died, I could not bear to hear it. The silence seemed safer. But lately I find myself wondering if silence is just another form of forgetting. Francis understood what he was really asking. Not just for music, but for permission to remember, to feel something besides the careful numbness he had cultivated. Tonight, then, after dinner, if you show me where the music room is. Relief washed over his features, so clear and unguarded that it made something tighten in Francis's chest. Tonight. The music room revealed itself that evening as a space frozen in time. Dust covers had been removed from the furniture, and candles lit the space with warm, flickering light. The pianoforte dominated one corner, a beautiful instrument of dark wood that gleamed in the candlelight. A violin case sat nearby, closed and untouched. John had positioned himself in a chair near the fire, far enough away to give her space, but close enough that she could feel his presence. He was watching her with an intensity that made her fingers tremble as she sat on the bench. "What would you like me to play?" "Whatever you feel." His voice was quiet. "I want to hear what you hear when no one is listening." Francis let her fingers rest on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her touch. She had not planned what to play, but as she began, the melody came from somewhere deep, a piece she had played in the weeks after her father's death. It was melancholic and searching, full of minor chords that ached with unspoken grief. As she played, Francis felt something break open inside her. All the pain she had carried since Grace's betrayal, the humiliation of being cast out, the fear of dying alone in the snow, the loss of her father and her home. It poured through her fingers into the music, each note a word she had not been able to speak. The melody shifted, finding moments of hope among the sorrow, brief glimpses of light before falling back into darkness. But even in the darkest passages, there was beauty, the kind that only comes from having survived something terrible. When the final notes faded, the silence was profound. Francis kept her hands on the keys, afraid to turn around, afraid of what she might see in John's face. Then she heard him move. Footsteps approached slowly, and she felt him stop just behind her, close enough that she could sense the heat of his body, smell the faint scent of sandalwood and wool. That was extraordinary. His voice was rough, as though the words cost him something. "I have heard countless performances in London, polished and perfect and utterly empty. But what you just played, it was not performance. It was truth." Francis turned on the bench and found herself looking up at him from mere inches away. His eyes were bright in the candlelight, and she thought she saw the gleam of tears held carefully in check. "Music is the only place I have ever been allowed to be completely honest." Her voice was barely a whisper. Everywhere else I had to be useful or quiet or accommodating, but at the piano I could say everything I was not permitted to say aloud. John's hand came up slowly, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. "I understand that better than you know. The weight of carrying things you cannot speak, the exhaustion of performing normalcy when everything inside is chaos. You lost your brother." Francis felt tears prick her own eyes. "You carry guilt for surviving when he did not. I can hear it in how you speak of him." His hand stilled against her cheek, and for a moment she thought she had gone too far. But then he spoke, and his voice was raw with emotion held too long. "I should have been faster. Should have realized what he was doing before the fire started. Should have gotten him out sooner, breathed for him somehow. The rational part of my mind knows it was not my fault, but the rest of me cannot accept it. Every day I wake up and he does not, and I do not know how to carry that without drowning in it." Francis reached up and covered his hand with her own, holding it against her face. "Surviving is not a betrayal. Living is not an insult to his memory. You honored him by pulling him out, by staying with him, by loving him enough to break when he died." She felt the tremor that ran through him, saw the careful control he had maintained for so long begin to crack. His other hand came up to frame her face, and his forehead dropped to rest against hers. They stayed like that, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, two people who understood what it meant to carry impossible weight. When John finally spoke again, his words were barely audible. You terrify me. Francis's breath caught. Why? Because you make me feel things I thought I had buried so deep they could never resurface. Because when I look at you, I see someone who understands not just my words, but the silence between them. Because every moment I spend with you makes me want more moments, and I do not know what to do with that want. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, and Francis felt herself leaning into the touch without conscious thought. Then you must understand how I feel. Because you have given me something I thought I would never have again. A place where I am valued for my mind, where my opinions matter, where I am not just tolerated but wanted. You have no idea what that means to someone who has spent her life being told she is too much and not enough all at once. They were so close now that Francis could count his eyelashes, could see the silver threading through the grey of his eyes. His gaze dropped to her lips, and she saw the desire there, clear and unmistakable. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain he could feel it. John leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Francis did not move. She let her eyes flutter closed, her lips parting slightly in anticipation of a kiss that felt inevitable as gravity. But before their mouths could meet, the music room door opened with a soft click. Mrs. Hargrove stood in the doorway, a letter in her hand and apology written across her features. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, miss. But this just arrived by messenger. It bears the seal of Walker House and is addressed to Miss Walker. The man said it was urgent." The spell shattered. John pulled back, his hands falling away from Francis's face. She felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache, but the mention of Walker House of Grace sent ice through her veins. "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove." Francis stood on unsteady legs, taking the letter with hands that trembled slightly. The housekeeper withdrew, but the damage was done. The intimate bubble they had created was broken, and reality pressed back in with crushing force. Francis stared at the letter, at Grace's familiar handwriting forming her name. She did not want to open it, did not want to know what cruel words or demands her sister had decided to send, but John was watching her, concern replacing the desire that had been in his eyes moments before, and she could not avoid it forever. She broke the seal and read quickly, her expression hardening with each line. When she finished, she looked up at John and saw her own future crumbling before it had even properly begun. The letter changed everything, and they both knew it. "Before we continue, I want to ask you something," Francis heard herself say, though the words felt distant. "We have built something here, you and I. In these few days I have felt more alive, more valued, more seen than I have in years. Please tell me I am not imagining it. Please tell me that what almost happened just now meant something." John crossed to her in 3 strides and took her hands in his, holding them with fierce certainty. "You are not imagining anything. What we have built is real. What I feel for you is real. And that kiss that was interrupted, I fully intend to claim it properly when there are no more barriers between us." Francis felt tears slip down her cheeks, but she was smiling despite them. "Then we will face whatever that letter says together. Because I am done running, done accepting crumbs when I deserve a feast. And you, John Montgomery, have made me believe I deserve more than I ever thought possible." He pulled her into an embrace, and Francis let herself be held, drawing strength from his solid presence. The letter from Grace could wait a few moments more. Right now in John's arms, with the memory of almost kissing him still burning on her lips, she had everything she needed to face whatever came next. But as they stood there in the candle-lit music room, both of them knew that the world beyond Ravenswood's gates was about to intrude, and nothing would be quite the same again. If you have felt even a fraction of what I felt listening to this story unfold, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support means the world and helps me continue sharing stories that touch the heart. And I am curious, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you are calling home. I love connecting with all of you. The letter felt heavy in Francis's hands, heavier than paper and ink had any right to be. She looked at John, drawing courage from the steadiness in his gaze, and then read aloud so he would know what they were facing. "Francis, I trust you have survived your foolish dramatics and found some temporary accommodation. The storm has passed, and it is time to set aside childish resentments and return home where you belong. I require your assistance with the account books immediately. The tenants are making unreasonable demands, and I need someone who understands their tedious complaints to manage them. Additionally, I am expecting a visitor next week, a gentleman of considerable standing who may prove advantageous to my prospects. The house must be prepared to proper standards, and you know better than anyone how Father preferred things arranged. I am willing to overlook your insubordination if you return promptly and conduct yourself with appropriate gratitude. A woman alone has few options in this world, Francis. You would do well to remember that family, however imperfect, is better than the charity of strangers who will eventually tire of your presence. Do not delay. I expect you within 3 days. Grace. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Francis carefully folded the letter, her hands surprisingly steady despite the fury building in her chest. John's voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet. She throws you out to die in a snowstorm, does not bother to inquire whether you survived, and now summons you back like a servant because she needs your labor. And she has the audacity to call it family obligation. Francis moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. She expects me to be grateful, to accept this as generosity because she is willing to let me return to organize her life and impress her suitor. You are not seriously considering it. She turned to look at him and saw the tension in his shoulders, the barely controlled anger in his eyes. Part of me wants to refuse simply to spite her, to prove that I do not need her, that I can survive without crawling back to Walker House. But he moved closer, his gaze searching her face. But she is still my sister, my only remaining family. And there is a part of me, a weak, pathetic part, that wonders if I owe her something simply because we share blood. Francis felt tears prick her eyes, hating the doubt even as she acknowledged it. What if I am being selfish? What if family loyalty demands that I swallow my pride and go back? John closed the distance between them and took her shoulders gently but firmly. Look at me. When she met his eyes, his expression was fierce. Family loyalty is not a chain that binds you to people who treat you with cruelty. Blood does not give someone the right to diminish you, to use you, to cast you aside when convenient, and summon you back when useful. I know that. Rationally, I know that. But emotionally, you still carry the weight of expectations that were placed on you from childhood. His voice softened slightly. I understand. I spent years believing I owed society my presence, my performance of grief, simply because that was what was expected of a duke. It took me far too long to realize that I owed myself more than that exhausting pretense. Francis felt something loosen in her chest, the validation of having her conflict understood rather than dismissed. What would you have me do? I would have you choose yourself. John's hands slid down her arms to capture her hands, his grip warm and sure. I would have you recognize that the woman who kept her father's estate running, who survived being thrown into a winter storm, who sees solutions I miss in drainage maps, who plays music that breaks hearts open, that woman deserves more than to be treated as disposable labor by someone who values her only when convenient. And what if I have nowhere else to go? What if leaving Grace means having nothing? His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. You have this. Us. Whatever this is becoming between us, you have a place here for as long as you want it, not as charity but as partnership. I need you, Francis, not to manage my accounts, though you do that brilliantly. I need you because you have woken something in me that I thought died with Edward. Because when I am with you, I remember what it feels like to be alive rather than simply existing. Francis felt tears spill over, but they were not tears of sadness. They were the release of pressure held too long, the breaking of a dam she had built to contain hope she thought was foolish. I am afraid. The admission came out as barely a whisper. I am afraid of trusting this, of believing it is real. I am afraid that if I turn my back on Grace completely, I will be cutting the last thread connecting me to who I was, to the family I grew up in. And I am terrified that if I stay here, if I let myself feel everything I am beginning to feel for you, I will be so completely undone that there will be no recovering if it falls apart. John pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like shelter and promise combined. Then let me be afraid with you. Let us build something together, brick by careful brick, and if it falls apart, at least we will have tried. But I do not think it will fall apart. I think what we are building is stronger than fear, stronger than the past, strong enough to withstand whatever storms come. Frances buried her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, breathing in the scent of him. When she finally pulled back enough to look up at him, she saw her own vulnerability reflected in his eyes and something more. Desire, yes, but also tenderness, determination, and a careful, growing love that neither of them had quite named yet. I will not go back to Walker House. The words came out firm, certain. I will write to Grace and tell her that I am no longer available to solve her problems or arrange her house or manage her tenants, that she made her choice when she threw me out, and now I am making mine. Relief washed over John's features. You are sure? I am terrified. But yes, I am sure. Frances felt a smile tug at her lips, despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. You have shown me what it feels like to be valued, rather than tolerated. I will not go back to accepting less than that even from family, especially from family. John's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away the last traces of tears. You are extraordinary. You know that, do you not? I am beginning to believe it might be true. The look that passed between them was charged with everything they had not yet said, all the feelings growing too large to contain. John leaned down slowly, and this time there was no interruption. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, asking permission even as it granted it. Frances responded by reaching up to tangle her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss. It was nothing like the chaste, polite kisses she had imagined in girlish daydreams. This was hunger and relief and recognition all at once. This was two people who had been alone too long, finally finding connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, John rested his forehead against hers. I have wanted to do that since the day you corrected my drainage plans. Despite everything, Frances laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. That is possibly the least romantic thing anyone has ever said after a first kiss. Is it not romantic that your intelligence was what first drew me? That watching your mind work made me want to know everything about you? John's smile was soft, genuine. I have been surrounded by people who wanted my title or my wealth or the story of my tragedy. You wanted to fix my water management and argue about crop rotations. It was the most attractive thing anyone had done in years. You have very strange criteria for attraction, says the woman who just agreed to stay with a reclusive duke rather than return to her family. We are both strange, I think. Perhaps that is why we fit. Frances let herself relax into his arms, feeling the rightness of it, the way her body seemed to know this was where it belonged. The letter from Grace lay on the piano where she had set it down, but it no longer felt like a summons or a threat. It was simply words on paper, powerless unless she gave them power. I should write my response tonight. Before I lose my courage, I will sit with you while you write it. John's arms tightened briefly before releasing her. You do not have to face it alone. They moved to the library, where Frances sat at the desk and John settled into a nearby chair, close enough for comfort, but far enough to give her space to think. She pulled out fresh paper and dipped the pen, considering her words carefully. In the end, she kept it simple. Grace, I will not be returning to Walker House. You made your position clear when you sent me into the storm, and I am making mine equally clear now. I am no longer available to manage your affairs or organize your household. I wish you well in your future endeavors, but our relationship as it was can no longer continue. When you are ready to treat me as a sister rather than a servant, perhaps we can rebuild something. Until then, I must choose my own path. Frances. She read it aloud to John, who nodded his approval. It is honest without being cruel, firm without closing the door entirely. Well done. Frances sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning post. As she did, she felt something shift inside her, a burden lifting that she had not fully realized she was carrying. The obligation to sacrifice herself for family approval, the belief that she owed Grace her loyalty regardless of how she was treated, the fear that she would always be powerless and dependent. All of it fell away, leaving something lighter in its place. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. The beginning of freedom. John stood and offered his hand. "It is late, you should rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Frances took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, but she did not move toward the door. Instead, she stepped closer, rising on her toes to press a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for seeing me when I had forgotten how to see myself, for giving me the courage to choose my own path." His eyes darkened with emotion, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her again, but instead he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt more intimate than anything that had come before. "The courage was always yours, Frances. I simply provided the safe space for you to remember it." As she walked back to her room, Frances felt the ghost of his kiss still warming her skin. The letter to Grace would be sent in the morning, and there would be consequences. But for tonight, she had chosen herself, and that choice felt like the beginning of everything. Behind her closed door, she pressed her fingers to her lips, remembering the kiss in the music room, and smiled into the darkness. Whatever came next, she would face it with John beside her, and that made all the difference. Morning arrived with brilliant sunshine that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Frances woke feeling lighter than she had in years. The letter to Grace sat sealed in the hall, ready for the morning post. She had made her choice. At breakfast, John seemed nervous, unusual for a man who normally projected such control. He waited until Mrs. Hargrove cleared the dishes before speaking. "The weather has finally cleared. I thought perhaps you might join me for a walk. There is a place I would like to show you." Frances saw something significant in his eyes, a weight to the invitation that went beyond companionship. "Of course. I would like that very much." They dressed warmly and stepped into the winter morning. The cold invigorated rather than threatened. Their breath misted as they walked, following a path toward a small frozen lake in the distance. John's hand covered hers on his arm, and Frances felt the tension in him. Something important was coming. The pavilion appeared as they crested a rise, a graceful structure of white stone at the lake's edge. Snow drifted against its columns, but inside a small brazier burned, and fir throws draped the stone benches. "You arranged this?" Frances looked at him with wonder. "I wanted somewhere private, somewhere beautiful." His voice held vulnerability. "Somewhere separate from the world for what I need to say." He helped her settle onto the soft fur before sitting close beside her. For a long moment, he stared at the frozen lake, gathering his thoughts. "I have spent 7 years in this house, Frances. 7 years convinced I was meant to live alone. That connection was too painful, that feeling nothing was safest." He turned to face her. "And then you appeared, half frozen and fighting for life. And something in me recognized something in you. Someone who understood what it meant to survive when the world wanted you gone." Frances felt tears prick her eyes but stayed silent. "These weeks with you have been a revelation, not just because you are brilliant with estate management, though you are. Not just because you are beautiful, though you take my breath away." John took her hands. "You have reminded me that surviving is not enough, that a life lived in careful isolation is still a form of death. You have made me want to truly live again, with all the risk and joy and terror that entails." He withdrew a folded paper, hands not quite steady. "This is a rough sketch. I wanted you to see what I have been imagining. A new conservatory on the eastern grounds, all glass and light, filled with growing things even in winter. A place where life persists when everything outside seems dead." Frances took the sketch, seeing elegant lines and careful notations. It was beautiful, a declaration of hope made tangible. "I want to call it the Frances Wing." His voice dropped lower. "Because that is what you have done for me. You have brought light and growth to a place frozen too long. You have made me believe new beginnings are possible, even for those who thought they had used up all their chances." He slid from the bench to kneel before her, and Frances's breath caught. She knew what was coming, but the reality still made her heart race. I am not proposing because you need refuge or because I require an estate manager. John's eyes held hers with fierce certainty. I am proposing because in these few weeks you have become essential to me. I want you as my wife, Frances. My partner in all things. I want your mind and your music and your fierce honesty. I want to wake beside you and know that you choose to be here, with me, every single day. Frances felt tears streaming down her face. I have nothing to bring, John. No dowry, no influential family, no connections, only scandal and a sister who will spread rumors. You could marry anyone. John's expression turned fierce. You bring yourself. Your courage, your intelligence, your capacity to see solutions where others see only problems. He squeezed her hands. I have title and wealth enough. What I lacked, what I have been starving for, was someone who sees me rather than the Duke. Someone who challenges me and comforts me and makes me want to be worthy. That is what you bring, Frances, and it is worth more than any dowry in England. She touched his face, feeling the scar beneath her fingers, the warmth of his skin. You must understand what you are taking on. Grace will not accept this quietly. Society will gossip. There will be those who say you were trapped by a scheming woman. Let them talk. I have not cared for society's opinion in 7 years. His hand covered hers against his cheek. All I care about is what you want, what you choose, not what seems practical or safe, but what your heart desires. Frances felt something break open inside her, all the careful control giving way. For once she allowed herself to want something simply because it would make her happy. Yes, the word came out choked with emotion. Yes, I will marry you. I will be your wife and your partner, and I will fill that conservatory with so many plants you will regret suggesting it. I will argue with you about estate management and play music until you tire of hearing it, and I will love you with everything I have, because you have given me something I never thought I would find. A home that is not just a building, but a belonging. John surged up to capture her mouth, and this kiss was different from the one in the music room. That had been tentative. This was celebration and claim and promise all at once. His hands framed her face as he deepened the kiss, and Frances responded with equal fervor, fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, John rested his forehead against hers. I do not have a ring yet. I will commission something, or there are family pieces. My grandmother's ring is particularly beautiful, sapphires and diamonds. But I wanted to ask you first. I do not need a ring to know this is real. Frances smiled through tears. But I will not refuse one when ready. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her close as they looked over the frozen lake. The sun climbed higher, making the ice gleam, and Frances thought she had never seen anything more beautiful than this moment. We should tell Mrs. Hargrove. John's voice rumbled against her ear. She will want to begin planning, and we should decide when. How soon are you willing to marry me? Is tomorrow too soon? Frances pulled back, only half joking. His smile transformed his serious face. If I could arrange it, I would marry you tomorrow. But perhaps we should allow a few weeks for the banns to be read, unless you prefer a longer engagement. Frances thought of Grace, of the gossip that would spread. Then she thought of John, of the conservatory named for her, of the life they could create together. A few weeks sounds perfect, long enough to do it properly, short enough that I cannot lose my nerve. You will not lose your nerve. John's confidence was absolute. You are the bravest person I have ever met, Frances Walker, soon to be Frances Montgomery, Duchess of Ravenswood. The title sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but anticipation. They walked back, hand in hand. Mrs. Hargrove took one look at their faces and burst into delighted tears. She had known, Frances realized, the fitted dresses, the private dinners, the music room prepared with care. That evening, they sat in the library planning their future with the same attention once given to drainage maps. But beneath the practical discussions was something warmer, shown in every glance and touch and smile. Frances felt John's hand find hers beneath the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. She looked up to find him watching with an expression that made her breath catch. Desire, yes, but also tenderness, and wonder and joy that seemed almost fragile. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise that this was real, that she was choosing him with full certainty. The letter to Grace had been sent. Whatever consequences came, they would face together. But tonight, Frances allowed herself to simply be happy. She had been abandoned in the snow on Christmas Eve, left to die by the person who should have protected her, but she had been found by someone who saw her worth when she could no longer see it herself. Against all odds, she was going to marry a duke who loved her not despite her sharp mind and fierce spirit, but because of them. And as John raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles while holding her gaze, Frances understood that the best chapters of her life were only just beginning. The evening following their engagement settled over Ravenswood Manor with a quietness that felt charged with possibility. Frances found herself unable to concentrate on the book she had brought to the library, the words blurring as her mind returned again and again to the feel of John's lips on hers, the way his hands had framed her face with such careful reverence. They were engaged now, promised to each other. The reality of it still felt almost dreamlike. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, the familiar cadence that made her heart quicken. John entered the library carrying 2 glasses of wine, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "I thought you might appreciate something to calm the nerves." He offered her one of the glasses, his fingers brushing hers as she took it. "Though I confess, I am the one who needs steadying. I keep expecting to wake and find this whole day was nothing but a dream." Frances set the glass down and stood, closing the distance between them. "If this is a dream, then we are sharing it. And I have no desire to wake." His free hand came up to touch her face, the gesture becoming familiar but no less affecting. "We should discuss what comes next. The announcement, the wedding plans, how we will handle the inevitable response from your sister and from society. Must we discuss it tonight?" Frances let her hand rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Can we not simply exist in this moment before the world intrudes with its expectations and judgments?" John set his own glass aside and pulled her closer until mere inches separated them. "What would you prefer we do with this evening, if not planning?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Frances felt her breath quicken, awareness flooding through her. She had been married once in name only, to a dying man her father hoped would provide security. That union had never been consummated, ending with his death before they had shared more than polite conversation. She was, in all ways that mattered, innocent of physical intimacy, but she was not afraid. "I would prefer—" She paused, gathering her courage. "I would prefer to stop wondering what it would be like to truly be yours, to choose this, choose you, without restraint or hesitation." John's eyes darkened, his breath catching audibly. "Frances, you do not have to rush toward anything because we are engaged. I can wait until we are properly married, but I do not want to wait." Her voice was steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "For so long, I have done what was expected, what was proper, what others deemed appropriate. I have been careful and restrained and so very cautious. Tonight, I want to choose something simply because I desire it, because you make me feel alive in ways I never thought possible." His hand slid into her hair, tilting her face up to his. "Are you certain? Once we cross this line, Frances, there is no returning to what we were before. I do not want to return. I want to move forward. With you." The kiss that followed was nothing like the ones before. This was hunger unleashed, careful control giving way to raw need. John's mouth moved against hers with an intensity that made her knees weaken, and she clung to him, matching his fervor with her own. His hands moved down her back, tracing the line of her spine through the fabric of her dress, pulling her flush against him. Frances gasped at the sensation, feeling the hard planes of his body against her softer curves, the heat between them building to something almost unbearable. "Not here." John's voice was rough against her ear. "Let me take you somewhere more comfortable, somewhere we will not be interrupted." He took her hand and led her through the quiet corridors to his private chambers, a room she had never entered. The space was masculine and spare, dominated by a large bed with dark hangings. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. John turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw desire warring with concern. "If at any point you wish to stop, you need only say so. I will not be offended. I will not think less of you. Your comfort and consent are paramount." Francis stepped closer, reaching up to begin unbuttoning his waistcoat with trembling but determined fingers. "I do not wish to stop. I wish to know you, completely, to be known by you in return." He helped her with the buttons, shrugging out of the waistcoat and then the shirt beneath, revealing the muscled torso she had only imagined. The firelight caught on old scars, marks of the fire that had taken his brother, and Francis traced them gently with her fingertips. "You are beautiful." Her voice was soft with wonder. "Every part of you, including the parts you hide from the world." John caught her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing each finger with deliberate care. "As are you, though I suspect you do not believe it. Teach me to believe it." He turned her gently and began working the buttons at the back of her dress, his fingers deft despite the slight tremor she could feel in them. As each button released, he pressed a kiss to the newly exposed skin, a trail of warmth down her spine that made her shiver with anticipation. The dress fell away, followed by layers of undergarments, until she stood before him in only her chemise. Francis felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the physical. John stepped back, his gaze moving over her with such reverence that she felt beautiful rather than merely seen. "You are exquisite, perfect in every way." He pulled her close again, and this time there were fewer barriers between them. The feel of his skin against hers, warm and solid, sent waves of sensation through her body. His mouth found hers again as his hands explored, learning the curves and valleys of her form with patient thoroughness. Francis let her own hands wander, tracing the muscles of his back, feeling them flex beneath her touch. When her fingers found the waistband of his trousers, she hesitated only a moment before continuing, emboldened by the sharp intake of his breath. He guided her toward the bed, laying her down with such care that tears pricked her eyes. This was nothing like the clinical discussions of wifely duty she had overheard among married women. This was tenderness and passion intertwined, a claiming that felt mutual rather than one-sided. "I have never," she faltered, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "I do not know what to do." John stretched out beside her, propping himself on one elbow to look down at her face. "Then we will learn together. There is no performance here, Francis, only honesty and trust. Tell me what feels good. Tell me if anything does not. Let this be a conversation rather than a conquest." He kissed her again, slowly, deeply, as his hand traced patterns along her side, her hip, her thigh. Each touch built the heat between them, until Francis found herself arching into his caresses, seeking more without quite knowing what more entailed. When his hand finally found the most intimate part of her, she gasped at the intensity of sensation. He gentled his touch, watching her face, adjusting his movements based on her responses. The pleasure built gradually, wave upon wave, until she was trembling beneath him. "Let go." His voice was rough with his own desire. "I have you. You are safe." And she did, crying out as pleasure crashed through her in pulsing waves. John held her through it, murmuring words of praise and wonder against her hair. When she could breathe again, she found him watching her with such naked desire that it sent a fresh flutter through her belly. That was. She could not find words adequate to describe it. Only the beginning. He shifted his weight, settling between her thighs. "This may hurt at first. I will be as gentle as possible, but if it becomes too much, tell me." Francis nodded, trusting him completely. As he entered her, there was indeed discomfort, a stretching and burning that made her tense. John stilled immediately, his forehead pressed to hers. His breathing labored with the effort of holding back. "Breathe. Just breathe. I will not move until you are ready." Gradually, her body adjusted to the intrusion. The pain faded to a dull ache, then to something else entirely. She shifted her hips experimentally and heard John groan. "May I?" His voice was strained. "May I move?" "Yes. Please." He began to move slowly, carefully, each thrust measured and controlled. Frances felt the friction building pleasure where there had been only discomfort, her body responding to his rhythm. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him closer, wanting to feel the weight of him, the reality of their union. The pace increased as they found a shared rhythm, moving together as though they had done this 1,000 times before. John's control finally broke, and he buried his face in her neck as his release shuddered through him. The intimacy of that moment, of feeling him lose himself inside her, brought tears to Frances's eyes. Afterward, they lay tangled together, skin damp with exertion, breathing gradually slowing. John rolled to his side and pulled her against him, his hand stroking her hair with infinite gentleness. "Are you all right? Did I hurt you too badly?" Frances turned in his arms to face him. "You were perfect. It was perfect. I feel." She searched for the right words. "I feel claimed and cherished all at once, as though I finally belong somewhere completely. You do belong here with me, always." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "No matter what comes, Frances, no matter what your sister says or what society whispers, you are mine now and I am yours, and nothing will change that." They lay together as the fire burned low, talking in quiet voices about their future, about the life they would build together. John spoke of the conservatory they would create, of children they might have, of growing old together in this house that had been so long lonely. And Frances realized that by losing everything she thought defined her, by being cast out and left to die, she had found something infinitely more valuable. Not just love, though she did love him with a fierceness that surprised her, but also herself, her own strength, her own worth, her own right to choose happiness. When she finally fell asleep in John's arms, she did so without fear or doubt. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Grace would respond with venom, society would gossip, there would be difficulties to navigate. But tonight, wrapped in warmth and safety, and the sweet exhaustion of love made physical, Frances knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen herself, and in doing so she had found everything she never knew she needed. 3 days after their night together, the carriage arrived. Frances was in the conservatory sketching plans for plantings when Mrs. Hargrove appeared, her expression troubled. "Miss Frances, Your Grace." "There is a visitor. Miss Grace Walker has arrived and is demanding to see her sister." Frances felt her stomach tighten, but John's hand found hers immediately, steady and warm. "Show her to the drawing room, Mrs. Hargrove. We will be there directly." Frances looked down at her simple morning dress, then at John. "Should I change into something more formal?" His expression was fierce with protectiveness. "You are the future Duchess of Ravenswood. You need change for no one. But if it would make you feel stronger, I will wait." "No." Frances straightened her shoulders. "I will face her as I am. As myself, not as whatever version she expects or demands." They walked to the drawing room together, and John's presence beside her felt like armor. When they entered, Grace stood by the window, her back rigid with displeasure. She turned at the sound of their footsteps, and her eyes widened at the sight of them together. Grace was beautiful in the way their mother had been, all golden hair and delicate features, but there was a hardness to her mouth that had not been there when their father was alive, a calculating coldness in her blue eyes. "Frances." Her voice dripped with false sweetness. "I see you have recovered from your little adventure in the snow. How fortunate that you found such generous hospitality." Frances moved further into the room, acutely aware of John a half step behind her, present but allowing her to lead. "Hello, Grace. I received your letter. And yet you did not respond." Grace's tone sharpened. "Nor did you return home as I requested. Instead, I am forced to travel in winter weather to retrieve my wayward sister from a situation that threatens to become scandalous. I am not returning to Walker House." Frances kept her voice calm, steady. "I wrote to tell you as much." I no longer consider it my home, nor do I consider myself subject to your authority." Grace's laugh was brittle. "Do not be absurd. You have nowhere else to go. No money, no prospects, and now you have been living unchaperoned in a bachelor's household. Your reputation is in tatters. The only hope you have of salvaging any respectability is to come home immediately and hope that people forget your foolishness. She is not living unchaperoned." John's voice cut through the room like a blade. "She is living under my protection as my betrothed. We are to be married within the month." Grace's face went white, then flushed with angry color. "Betrothed? You cannot be serious." She turned to Francis with venom in her eyes. "What did you do, you scheming creature? Trap him somehow? Compromise him into offering marriage?" Francis felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "I trapped no one. John proposed freely, and I accepted. We will be married with or without your blessing." "This is ridiculous." Grace's composure was cracking. "You are a penniless widow with no connections and nothing to offer. Why would a duke, choose you when he could have anyone?" "Because I love her." John moved to stand beside Francis, his hand finding hers. "Because she is intelligent and brave and sees the world with clarity most people lack. Because she makes me want to be better than I was." "Those are the reasons, Miss Walker, and they are the only ones that matter." Grace stared at them, and Francis saw the moment her sister's strategy shifted. The false concern dropped away, replaced by naked calculation. "I see. This is revenge, then. You are punishing me for sending you away by attaching yourself to the first man who showed you kindness." She turned to John. "Your Grace, surely you can see that my sister is confused, perhaps suffering from the effects of her ordeal. She is not thinking clearly. Once she returns to familiar surroundings, this infatuation will fade. I am thinking more clearly than I ever have." Francis stepped forward, and she felt John's support like a warmth at her back. "You want to know why I will not return, Grace? It is not because I am angry, though I have every right to be. It is because I finally understand that family is not obligation. Family is not blood that binds you to people who diminish you. Family is choice and respect and genuine care. You ungrateful." Grace's mask slipped entirely. "After everything I have done for you, keeping you fed and housed after father died, you kept me as unpaid labor." Francis felt years of resentment rising. "I managed the accounts, dealt with the tenants, kept the household running while you attended parties and sought a husband. And when I dared to question your cruelty toward people who depended on us, you threw me into a snowstorm and hoped I would die. Do not speak to me of gratitude. I did no such thing." Grace's voice rose. "You chose to leave. You stormed out in a fit of dramatics. You ordered me out of the house on Christmas Eve, knowing I had no money and nowhere to go." Francis felt her own voice strengthening. "You locked the doors behind me while a blizzard raged. If John had not been traveling that road, I would be dead. And I do not believe for a moment that outcome would have troubled you. How dare you?" Grace looked between them, fury and something like panic mixing in her expression. "You think you can simply walk away from your responsibilities, from your family? Society will hear of this. I will make certain everyone knows how you schemed your way into a duke's bed." John's voice turned to ice. "Say one more word about Francis's character, Miss Walker, and you will discover exactly how much power a duke has to make life difficult for those who displease him. My future wife is beyond reproach. If you spread rumors to the contrary, I will ensure that every door in society closes to you. Every tradesman will refuse your custom. Every respectable family will turn away when you enter a room. Test me on this if you wish." The threat hung in the air, and Francis saw fear flicker across Grace's face. Her sister had not expected this, had not imagined that Francis would find not just shelter, but genuine protection, real power to stand behind her. "You cannot do this." Grace's voice had lost its certainty. "I am your sister, Francis, your only family. You stopped being my family when you chose cruelty over compassion." Francis felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "I wanted to believe that underneath the resentment and the bitterness, there was still the sister I grew up with, the girl who used to read to me when I was sick, who helped me learn to dance, who once cared about something beyond her own advancement. But that person is gone if she ever truly existed. Grace's face twisted. Fine. Marry your duke. Live in your grand house. But when he tires of you, when he realizes you are nothing special, you will have nowhere to turn. Do not come crawling back to me, I will not. Frances met her sister's eyes steadily. I wish you no harm, Grace. I hope you find happiness and perhaps someday the capacity to care about someone beyond yourself. But I am done accepting crumbs and calling it love. I deserve more than that, we all do. Grace opened her mouth, closed it, then turned on her heel and swept toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back one last time. You will regret this. No. Frances felt John's hand squeeze hers gently. I do not think I will. Grace left without another word, her footsteps echoing through the hall. They heard the front door open and close, the sound of a carriage departing. And then there was only silence. Frances stood very still, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over her. She had severed the last tie to her old life, spoken truth she had held for too long, chosen her future over her past. John turned her gently to face him, his hands framing her face. Are you all right? To her surprise, Frances realized she was. I am. I thought it would hurt more, cutting that final tie, but instead I feel, she searched for the word, free. I feel free. He pulled her into his arms and she let herself be held, drawing strength from his solid presence. You were magnificent, so strong and clear. I am in awe of you. Frances pulled back to look at him, this man who had saved her life and then given her reasons to truly live it. She threatened you. Threatened us. Are you certain you want to face society's gossip, Grace's rumors, all the complications I bring with me? John's smile was soft but certain. I am more certain of you than I have been of anything in 7 years. Let them gossip. Let them speculate. None of it matters compared to what we have built together. Frances rose on her toes to kiss him, pouring into it all the gratitude and love and wonder she felt. When they broke apart, both were smiling. Mrs. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, relief evident on her face. She is gone, then. She is gone. Frances felt the truth of it settle into her bones, and she will not be welcome to return unless she can approach with genuine respect. The housekeeper nodded approvingly. Good. You deserve better than that, miss. You always have. Now, shall I bring tea? I imagine you could both use something calming. As Mrs. Hargrove bustled away, Frances looked around the drawing room of Ravenswood Manor. This house that had seemed so intimidating when she first arrived now felt like home. The man beside her, who had seemed so unapproachable, now felt like the other half of her soul. She had lost her father, her childhood home, and now finally her sister. But in losing everything, she had gained something infinitely more precious. The freedom to choose her own path, the courage to demand respect, and the love of a man who saw her worth even when she had forgotten it herself. John tucked her against his side, and they stood together at the window, watching the winter landscape. The carriage carrying Grace was already out of sight, disappearing down the road like a chapter closing. What are you thinking? John's voice was quiet against her hair. Frances smiled. I am thinking that sometimes the best thing that can happen is losing what you thought you needed, because only then can you find what you actually deserve. And what do you deserve, Francis Walker? Soon to be Montgomery. She turned in his arms to look up at him. This you. A life built on honesty and partnership and love that does not demand I make myself smaller to fit. I deserve all of that, and I am done settling for less. Then you shall have it. John's promise was fierce and tender all at once. Every day for the rest of our lives, I will make certain you have it. And as he kissed her there in the winter light, Frances understood that she had not just survived being cast into the snow on Christmas Eve. She had been reborn, transformed from someone who accepted what she was given into someone who demanded what she deserved. It was the greatest gift she had ever received. Winter gradually released its grip on Ravenswood. The snow that had nearly claimed Frances's life melted into streams that fed the awakening land. Buds appeared on bare branches, and the first brave flowers pushed through the softening earth. It felt like the world itself was celebrating the transformation happening within the manor's walls. The wedding took place on a clear April morning in the estate's private chapel. Francis had refused a grand London affair, wanting something intimate and genuine, rather than a spectacle for society's amusement. John had agreed without hesitation, understanding that this day was about them, not about performing for an audience that had never cared about either of them. Mrs. Hargrove had wept while helping Francis dress in a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with lace at the sleeves that had belonged to John's mother. There was no father to give her away, no sister to stand beside her, but the absence of those expected figures felt right rather than sad. This was a beginning, not a continuation of the past. As Francis walked down the chapel aisle, she saw John waiting at the altar, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Love and wonder and gratitude all mingled there, as though he still could not quite believe she was real, that this was truly happening. The ceremony was brief but profound. When John slipped his grandmother's sapphire ring onto her finger, Francis felt the weight of it, not as a burden but as a promise. When they spoke their vows, she meant every word with a certainty that resonated in her bones. The kiss that sealed their marriage was tender and deep, a public claiming that made heat rise to her cheeks, even as she leaned into it. The small gathering of servants and a few neighboring families who had remained loyal to John through his years of isolation applauded, and Francis realized she had never felt so thoroughly seen and celebrated. The wedding breakfast was held in Ravenswood's dining room, no longer feeling cavernous but warm and full of life. There was music and laughter, things that had been absent from these walls for far too long. John kept her hand in his throughout the meal, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm, a private language developing between them. When the guests finally departed and evening settled over the manor, John led Francis outside. The conservatory construction had begun, and he wanted to show her the progress. They walked through the gardens as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. The framework of the new structure rose from the eastern grounds, glass panels catching the fading light. It was going to be magnificent, a palace of greenery and warmth even in the depths of winter. The Francis Wing. John's voice held quiet pride. Though I am beginning to think the name inadequate, it should be called the Phoenix Wing for what you have risen from. What we both have risen from. Francis leaned against him, feeling the solid comfort of his presence. I like Francis Wing better. It reminds me that I matter, that my presence here has meaning beyond what I can do or manage, that I am valued simply for existing. You are valued beyond measure. John turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I know I have said this before, but I need you to hear it again. You saved me, Francis, not just from loneliness or grief, though you did save me from both. You saved me from a half-life, from existing without truly living. You reminded me that joy is possible, that connection is worth the risk, that love can heal even the deepest wounds. Francis felt tears prick her eyes. You saved me first, literally, from the snow, but also from a life of diminishment, of accepting scraps and calling it sustenance. You showed me what it means to be truly seen and valued. They stood together in the gathering darkness, the manor behind them glowing with welcoming light, the conservatory framework before them promising growth and renewal. Francis thought about the night she had walked into that storm, believing her life was ending. How impossible it would have seemed then that mere months later, she would be standing here as a duchess, a wife, a woman who had found not just survival but genuine happiness. What are you thinking? John's voice was soft against her hair. Francis smiled. I'm thinking about Christmas Eve. How terrified I was, how certain I was dying, how the cold felt like it was stealing everything from me. And now, here I am, warm and safe and loved beyond anything I imagined possible. It is almost too much to comprehend. John's arms tightened around her. I think about that night often. I almost did not stop. I was traveling fast, wanting to reach home before the worst of the storm hit. But something made me look to the side of the road, and I saw what I thought was a pile of rags or an abandoned bundle. He paused, and she felt him shudder slightly. If I had been even a minute later. But you were not. Francis turned in his arms to look up at him. "You stopped. You saved me. And in doing so, you saved yourself. We saved each other, John. That is what makes this so perfect." They kissed as the stars began to appear overhead, and Francis felt a completeness she had never known existed. This was what love was supposed to be, not obligation or duty or making yourself smaller to fit someone else's expectations, but partnership and passion and the freedom to be wholly yourself with another person. Later, they stood on the terrace overlooking the valley, watching the moonlight paint the landscape in silver. Francis found herself remembering all the moments that had led to this one. The library where they first truly spoke, the music room where she had bared her soul through piano keys, the pavilion where he had proposed, the bedroom where they had joined their bodies as they had already joined their hearts. Every step had been a choice. Every moment had been a decision to move forward rather than retreat into fear or past pain. And now they stood here, married and beginning a life together that would be shaped by those same choices, made daily, to love each other with honesty and courage. "Do you have regrets?" John's question came quietly. "About Grace, about how things ended with your family." Francis considered carefully before answering. "I regret that she could not be better, that the relationship we had as children could not survive into adulthood. But I do not regret standing up for myself, refusing to accept mistreatment simply because it came from family. Some bridges need to burn, John. Otherwise, you remain tied to shores that will never let you sail free." Wise words from my brilliant wife. She smiled at the word. Wife. It still felt new, thrilling in ways she had not expected. "Your Duchess." Even better. He pulled her close and they swayed slightly, dancing to music only they could hear. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "At least a dozen times. But I will never tire of hearing it." "Good, because I plan to tell you every day for the rest of our lives." John's voice turned serious. "You have given me back the future, Francis. Before you, I was simply enduring, waiting for time to pass. Now I find myself impatient for tomorrow, eager to see what we will build together." Francis thought about the conservatory rising from the ground, about the plans they had for improving the estate, about the possibility of children who might one day run through these halls, bringing laughter and chaos. She thought about growing old with this man, about decades of partnership and passion and quiet moments like this one. It was more than she had ever dared hope for, more than she had believed she deserved. But she had learned through pain and survival and ultimately triumph that she deserved everything, that settling for less was a betrayal of the person she had fought so hard to become. "Take me to bed, husband." She rose on her toes to whisper against his ear. "I wish to begin our married life properly." His laugh was low and full of promise, as my lady commands. They walked back into Ravenswood Manor hand in hand, leaving the night to the stars and the awakening land. Behind them, the skeleton of the conservatory stood silhouetted against the sky, a promise of life continuing even in darkness, of growth possible even after the harshest winter. Francis Walker had walked into a snowstorm on Christmas Eve, expecting to die. But she had been found, had been saved, and had discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to gain what truly matters. She had lost her father, her home, her sister, and the identity she had built around being useful to others. In return, she had gained herself, her voice, her strength, her right to demand respect and love in equal measure. And she had gained John, a man who saw her not as a burden to be tolerated or a tool to be used, but as a partner to be cherished and a soul to be loved without reservation. As they climbed the stairs to their shared chambers, Francis looked back once at the grand entrance hall of Ravenswood. This was home now. Not because these walls sheltered her, but because within them she had found the freedom to become who she was always meant to be. And that, she thought, as John drew her into his arms, and the world narrowed to just the two of them, was the greatest gift of all. Not rescue or refuge, but the space and support to rescue herself. To become not what others demanded, but what she chose. The snow had tried to take her life that Christmas Eve. Instead, it had given her a new one, better, truer, and entirely her own. Sometimes the coldest winters lead to the most brilliant springs. Frances thought her story ended in that snowdrift, abandoned and alone. Instead, it was only beginning. She learned that family is not always blood, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes you must lose everything to discover what you are truly worth. If this story touched your heart, I would be deeply honored if you would leave a like. Your support helps share these stories with others who might need to hear them. Please subscribe to continue this journey with me through more tales of love, courage, and second chances. And I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Leave a comment with your location and let me know which moment resonated most with you. Thank you for spending this time with Frances and John. Until the next story, may you always have the courage to choose yourself.